This episode is brought to you by Progressive, home of the Name Your Price tool. You say how much you want to pay for car insurance, and they'll show you coverage options that fit your budget. It's easy to start a quote. Visit Progressive.com to get started. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, January 28th, 1967, the US, UK, and the Soviet Union signed an agreement that would lead to the first set of space laws. So here we are at the height of the Cold War, the height of the space race, and three of the major political powers are getting together to basically say, you know what, we should cool it a little bit up there. And most notably, the law would outlaw the deployment of nuclear weapons in space. So I am no space expert, but it seems like a good idea to say no nukes in space. And it also established, I would say, we'll get into this, but like a bit of a spirit in which countries would travel to outer space. Less about conquering territory and claiming ownership and more about exploration and scientific advancement. But like all good treaties, it did leave out a lot. There was a lot of gray area, and especially now as space travel has become more and more privatized, it feels like the legacy of this treaty is very complicated and worth digging into. So let's do that now. Here, as always, Nicole Hammer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
So we can go all three on the record as saying we are anti-exploding nuclear weapons in space, correct?
I'm open to it.
Okay.
I mean, I feel like this
I'd
is
like to see what it would do.
It's like a plot from Minions or something. Like, who's going to nuke the moon? What are you trying to nuke? What are you doing? Like, why?
It was nuking time in 1967. People were nuking everything. I mean, that was part of it.
Would there be a mushroom cloud? What would it look like?
Yeah.
In a zero gravity environment? But we were like testing nukes underground and underwater. So it's actually pretty imaginable that they would have been like, what about space? What if we nuke the moon?
So how is it that these three powers who, don't have a lot of common ground at this time get together to do this?
Well, it was something that had been in the air for a while. Obviously, there were growing tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union in the 1950s because both had become nuclear powers by 1949. And that began to become even more tense once the Soviet Union launched the first successful satellite, Sputnik, in 1957. And that was the beginning of the attempts to do some negotiations to figure out, if we've conquered orbit, what does that mean for nuclear powers? But at the time, because the U.S. didn't have the ability to launch a satellite into orbit, the Soviet Union was asking for concessions, terrestrial concessions to get the U.S. out of areas that the Soviet Union didn't want it. And so that was a real impasse until the U.S. was able to catch up a little bit in the space race.
Yeah, I think that's a really important moment to talk about the fact that the Soviet Union has leverage based on the fact that it's got orbits already in outer space. And the United States is frantically trying to catch up with all of the technology and, the launch to the moon. And so this becomes a conversation that becomes more and more necessary to have the more space travel becomes a reality.
Yeah.
And by 1963, things have been changing. There have been a couple of kind of close calls on the nuclear front in 1961 and 1962. And so there is an effort to begin to think, okay, obviously we are arch rivals, but we have to put some brackets around what we are doing in terms of nuclear weapons. So you get the signing of the Limited Test Ban Treaty that bans nuclear tests underwater and nuclear tests in space. But it also opens up a conversation of, what other limits should we be thinking of now that the atomic age and the space age have become one and the same? And it's actually the Soviet foreign minister who floats this idea about including banning the orbiting of objects that have nuclear weapons on them.
Yeah. So there's this period 63 to 66 where all the tensions you described are there and the UN gets involved and the countries start to kind of move towards this big outer space treaty, as it was called. It has a very much longer name, but colloquially known as the Outer Space Treaty.
You're not going to do it?
No, I'm not going to do it. We move now to January 27th, 1967, a couple of the things that happen on that day that it's ratified. There's a ceremony in the East Room at the White House. LBJ signs it. At the signing ceremony, he quotes Martin Luther, from 400 years ago, Martin Luther, and he says, Martin Luther said, "Cannons and firearms are cruel and damnable machines. I believe them to have been direct suggestion of the devil." And he says, kind of imagine what he would have said at the Weapons and Destruction Week capable now. And so... I think they really are evoking this kind of existential ideas. I mean, it makes me think of Oppenheimer and the stakes there and the sort of thinking there. The other thing, and I think people who are space nerds out there and know the history of space will hear that date, January 27th, 1967. And in a kind of pure and tragic coincidence, that is also the day that the first 3 American astronauts who were part of the moonshot program were killed in that fire aboard Apollo 1, which is a sort of notable moment in the space. But that happened that same day, and there's reports of the kind of news of that breaking out in the sort of party reception that took place after the signing of this treaty. And I mean, it's like all of the people who care about space exploration are gathered in this one room, and then this news breaks. It's kind of a stunning moment.
Yeah, it's a moment, too, in which these weren't unknown people to the people who were gathered at the White House in that room. They knew them. They knew the astronauts. They knew their wives and their families. And so to have to make that announcement, it's such a joyous occasion that 3 American astronauts have now lost their lives. It makes everyone, I think, sort of reconsider the work that they're doing and the stakes that are involved and how dangerous this is, not just at the sort of stratospheric level, but even down on the ground trying to do this work, that, people can lose their lives just trying to get to space.
And there's something poignant about it as well, which is, what are we doing this for? Are we just launching these astronauts into space to make them an extension of the wars and the feuds and the violence on Earth? Or is it for some kind of higher cause? And I do think that this outer space treaty was a moment when there was a kind of recalibration. Yeah. This idea that, okay, we're going to continue to battle it out down here on Earth, but there is going to be a common cause that we are going to be working on. And that spirit of, it's not quite utopian, but even just that spirit of cooperation is going to be an important part of détente, of the thawing of the Cold War, but also of the vision that space is something special. I don't think it was great that the U.S. put a flag on the moon. I don't think that was the spirit of the space treaty. But, it gets recaptured in things like the Star Trek series and just that idea that, this can be a place for learning more about the universe in a pretty hopeful, and inspiring way. Mm-hmm.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting The World Together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
And just the simple fact that the U.S. and the Soviet Union are collaborating on joint missions throughout the 60s into the 70s into the 80s has always just kind of stunned me, because this is the same period at which just think about territory, a sliver of land in East Asia, or a little set of islands off of Argentina, or a little sliver of land in Central America are the most critical thing in the world. And you have these entire superpowers fighting over this little territory, as the domino theory is arguing that, you have to win every moment. And then in space, it's we're going to do stuff together. It's just kind of, it is stunning. To your
we're
point.
going to grow mushrooms and
It's the new frontier. No one really knew what they were getting into. In terms of what they might find or what might find them or whatever. And so I think there's a little bit more trepidation about things that you are unfamiliar with.
But also I think some genuine kind of restraint, for lack of a better word, right?
Yeah, for sure.
And then I think what starts to happen is a little bit more recently, some things start to test that restraint. Because I think, as I said in the intro, a lot of this treaty, the nuke thing is pretty straightforward, right? But other than that, it is really more kind of like, let's have a spirit of restraint and camaraderie up there. And inevitably, there's gray areas there, and there are things that start to test it. And so one, I think, is other countries start to be real heavyweights in the space race. And so you have China, and I think India's space program has really taken off recently. But, China, I think in particular, reached parts of space that the United States thought wasn't possible, and it started to spook them. And then, of course, in the last 10 years, let's call it, the rise of private space exploration and travel has really started to just shine a light on the gray areas in this treaty.
Yeah, billionaires like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk who want to, make space their next frontier as well. That to me is a little disturbing as well. It's not that I think that the government has more restraint per se, but to be a private citizen and sort of be able to launch something into outer space is sort of oh, I think we need more rules. Just a little bit. A little bit more guidelines.
There's also a lot of concern, especially as information warfare becomes such a critical issue of what does it mean if there's a Chinese satellite going over the United States and gathering information? And I think that there's a lot of just a lot of anxiety over space and what people are doing up there that reflects the tensions between the U.S. and China and other countries, and the sense that there are places they can't control, and they don't love that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, there's a privatization of space, and I think just kind of both in the language and just kind of what we understand about the Jeff Bezoses and the Elon Musks of the world, we understand the kind of impetus. It just tilts more towards acquiring resources than it does towards, spirit of collaborative discovery. But then there are sort of concrete things, as you were pointing out, Niki, of different countries that have established kind of more militarized space programs. And so now, Russia, China, India, Iran, Israel, France, and North Korea have kind of military space programs. The U.S. under Trump established the Space Force.
Mm-hmm.
And so now there is a push for a new set of agreements, So at the same time we're seeing that play out, we're seeing kind of an effort to kind of update or fill in some of the gaps of this outer space treaty. There's a thing called the Artemis Accords, which is a framework that establishes the rules for the peaceful use of space and governs behavior on the moon. And I'm sure, is thinking ahead from there. I don't know. It feels like a very perilous moment on that front.
Yeah,
it does. And, one of the things that we kind of skipped over that I think we'll talk about in another episode is that the early negotiations over what a treaty for space might look like came out of the signing of the treaty for Antarctica, and the idea that would be a space not owned by anyone. And so I wonder, as we're thinking about the tensions that are growing now, if there are positive examples of cooperation or other models that can be used to kind of guide countries through this very fraught period. Because I do think that Antarctica example was a pretty great one. I like that one.
Yeah.
It's nice when a positive example like that gets replicated.
Yeah. I think it's just harder for countries that are poorer to be able to have similar opportunities to generate wealth for themselves when you have these sort of superpowers that are, first and the fastest at getting access to additional resources and things of that nature. It raises a lot of moral and ethical questions for sure about who gets what and how.
Yeah. So if anything, listeners, after you listen to this, it is worth going and tracking down a list of countries that have space programs. It's a lot of countries. I rattled off the ones that I think we understand are the ones who are capable of putting up satellites and have sent astronauts into space and can do all other things. But I was surprised at how sweeping the list of countries that have space programs are like, including Costa Rica. How many people work for the Costa Rican Space Agency? I'd be very curious. Chile, Turkmenistan apparently has a pretty good space program going.
Brazil, too.
It's just a guy said, well, yeah, Brazil, sure. But, it is an interesting and sort of longer list than I would have expected. But let's leave it there. And let's talk about some also on this day. So other things that happened on January 28th. 1911, this isn't fully political history, but it kind of plays into some interesting through lines that we've touched on. But the notorious Hope Diamond was sold by the jeweler Pierre Cartier to some socialites, Edward and Evelyn McLean of Washington, D.C. It was sold for $180,000. The Hope Diamond famously has a curse attached to it. There's all these stories of people who owned it dying over the generations, and eventually they were just like, actually, the Smithsonian, you take this thing. And so that's where it sits. And I have memories of kind of going to visit the Hope Diamond when it was at the Smithsonian, and both being excited and also being like, this is kind of weird. Like all these people who are hyped up about walking by this.
It's just a rock.
It's just a rock.
I went down a real rabbit hole when I saw that this was on the stage.
Oh, really?
This stuff is fascinating, both the science around the Hope Diamond, but also the quote-unquote curse. There's a line in the Wikipedia page that was like, although the curse didn't come to pass for another 8 years, and then just leaves it hanging there, like never explains like what happened 8 years later to fulfill the curse.
Well, you know what happened to that Wikipedia editor, mid-sentence.
That's right. Tried to type it and
it's no more. In 1916, Louis D. Brandeis was nominated by President Woodrow Wilson to the Supreme Court, and Brandeis would become the court's first Jewish member. Also the namesake of Brandeis University.
Yeah.
Nice.
Up there in Boston.
Mm-hmm.
And in 1973, a ceasefire officially goes into effect to end the Vietnam War, a day after the signing of the Paris Peace Accords by the United States, North Vietnam, and South Vietnam. And 2 years later, the country would be reunified.
And in 1986, another space-related story. This kind of late January is an inauspicious moment in space history, because this is when the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded 73 seconds after liftoff in Cape Canaveral. That was in 1986. We have done a couple episodes that touch on that. All right. Well, we will leave it there. Make sure to sign up for the newsletter so you get more also on this day's and analysis of all the various tidbits of history that we try and cover on this show. You can do that at thisdaypod.com. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening to This Day in Esoteric Political History. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Our transcripts, which you can find on our website, are done by Kala Nakua. This Day is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, creator-owned, listener-supported podcasts. Audrey Martovich is executive producer. Yuri Lasordo is director of operations. If you want to support the show, tell a friend about This Day and become a member of Radiotopia at whatever level works for you. You can do that at our website, thisdaypod.com. Also on our site, you can find transcripts, sign up for our newsletter, find links to follow us on Instagram and Threads, buy merch like shirts and hats and phone cases, find information about our theme song, give feedback on an episode we've done, or suggest topics for a future episode. That and lots more, thisdaypod.com. My name is Jody Avirgan. We'll see you soon.
Radiotopia from